Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those of you joining us online today. My name is Alexandra Bilak. I'm the director of IDMC, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to our 2023 Internal Displacement Conference. It has been 25 years since the establishment of the guiding principles on internal displacement and of IDMC. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity to reflect on a quarter of a century's work and progress, thanks in no small part to the hard work and dedication of many of you with us here today. I joined IDMC a decade ago, or almost a decade ago, at a time when IDPs were dangerously close to falling off the international agenda, overshadowed as they were by a global debate that was focused almost exclusively on refugees and on migrants. So fast forwarding to what our organization has become today, I can't help but feel pride at how far we've come in giving IDPs the visibility that they deserve and in positioning internal displacement as a key priority on the global agenda. From the 20 or so countries that IDMC monitored back in the early 2000s, we now have the data and the tools to report on internal displacement in over 200 countries and territories across the world. By constantly improving our monitoring methods and our capacity, and by conducting new research and analysis, we have helped to paint an ever more comprehensive picture of this phenomenon and to connect it to some of the most pressing challenges of the 21st century. We have fought common misconceptions, we've opened up new spaces for dialogue, and we have shaped a new and more nuanced narrative around this issue. Importantly, we've also helped shift the way in which governments and the international community think about and address internal displacement, looking beyond initial responses to seeing it now as an integral part of their own sustainable development priorities. But we've certainly not been alone in achieving this. None of this would have been possible without the loyal support of our partners from government, the UN system, civil society, academia, and the private sector. We're particularly grateful to our donors who have grown in numbers over the years and who have placed their trust in our institution, some of you literally since day one. You have shown unwavering support to the world's internally displaced and to IDMC's work, and we're very grateful for your continued support and advice. We should not, of course, underestimate the many challenges that still lie ahead of us. Too many recent events are a reminder of how fragile results can be and how we must remain realistic with our expectations. We're pleased to be presenting today a report that documents the opportunities, the challenges, and the progress that has been made by many different actors working on the issue over the years. We hope that this type of report, which documents good practices and reflects on the conditions that make progress possible, can help advance a continued commitment and positive outcomes for IDPs. I'd like to acknowledge that this report is the result of months of hard work by all my colleagues who are here with me today and to whom I'd like to extend a special thank you and heartfelt congratulations. Our team of dedicated professionals remains IDMC's most precious resource, and it's their talent that will ensure our organization's stability and success in the future. So we have a great program lined up for you today. You'll be hearing from my colleague Christelle Cazabat, who will present the key highlights of the report, which is also available in hard copy just outside this room. Before we are joined by an outstanding panel of speakers whom we've brought together for the occasion to trace the history of internal displacement and of IDMC from the early 1990s to today. And my colleague Don Vout, who will be moderating this discussion, will introduce them all to you shortly. But before we begin, I would like to express my deep and sincere gratitude to the Norwegian Refugee Council, an outstanding and principled organization which I'm honored to have served for the past decade, an organization which 25 years ago had the good sense to found IDMC and which has hosted and borne with us ever since. So a special thank you to you, Jan Egeland, Secretary General of NRC, who's here with us today and whom I now give the floor to for the keynote address. Over to you, Jan.
Many thanks, Alexandra, and congratulations to you and the wonderful IDMC team here present today. In NRC, we are proud to have been, I don't know, godfather and godmother, but also the host of IDMC, since it was the first IDP project in 1998. And many others here, including Trygve Nordby, who was my predecessor at the time. Several others of the panel will know how this developed. From very humble beginnings to now being the leader in documenting, monitoring, discussing, but also trying to provide solutions for the internally displaced. It took 50 years from the birth of the Norwegian Refugee Council in 1946 on the ruins of the Second World War. Norwegian people felt it's pretty bad here in Norway. We had Nazi occupation for 5 years, and Finnmark is burnt, and so on. But it's much worse down in Europe, where Central Europe was in ruins, more than 10 million refugees. So we need to start with the Europe Aid, as it was called at its time, soon after it became the Norwegian Refugee Council for refugees. And then for 50 years, more and more work for more and more refugees, beginning in Europe, and it's put by Europeans now that there is talk about, should we monitor, should we change the refugee convention? Maybe it's not really fit for purpose. Well, it was fit for purpose when Europeans were refugees, so why wouldn't it be fit for purpose when primarily others are refugees? Actually, what's happening in Ukraine now after the Russian assault should remind us of how important the principles are. But there was a missing thing in all of this over those decades, namely those who fled their homes but couldn't or wouldn't leave their country. It was really the forgotten and neglected part of the humanitarian responsibility. I was in the 1990s in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a young state secretary. Trygve Nordby was the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. And I think the idea emerged on many sides, saying, we're traveling to Colombia and to Congo and across Africa and the Middle East. And there are apparently millions of people who are not there on the international agenda just because they haven't left their country. So we tried to get this catalogued and monitored, and today we have the GEM, which is the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre. So it's a big step forward that we know today. We didn't know at that time. Because with knowledge starts the possibility to discuss solutions. And that is, of course, I think the outcome also, I hope, of today is it doesn't necessarily get better in the Kivu because we in this room agree that it's really very bad to be an internally displaced person in northern Kivu or in Ituri. It is when we have people who can deploy there, give assistance, help with the violence that they are experiencing, helping them with development opportunity, help them to get protection and security, then we've done our job. And I think IDMC is a big step in that direction. And we have, of course, here a special rapporteur, Paula Gaviria Betancur, and we have special advisor for solutions, Robert Piper here. We look really forward to hear from you how we can work together for protection and solutions. Because I think really the with the celebration of today, 25 years of progress in documenting and discovering and revealing the problem of internal displacement, we also have to realize that maybe there were 25 million when we started in 1998 of IDPs. And I think, the commensurate figure was from IDMC, 62.5 million, I think, at the end of last year. It's anywhere between 60 and 70 million now. Figures will be released later when we have them. It's going in the wrong direction. And that is the urgency of addressing the internal displacement problem, crisis, horrors. The way it is now, it cannot continue. Of course, two things have to change. It's very simple. We have to protect people so they don't become displaced. Internally displaced, later on, many of them become refugees. And the other big urgency is we have to help people out of displacement and dependency. You cannot travel, as I do routinely, to the worst corners of the planet. Stop listening to people who say, we just need to be back on our 2 feet, really. We had a wonderful life. I had a home, I had a livelihood, I had a family, etc. And look at me now. Help me back to the situation I was in. So, we're failing on two fronts. We are failing from not having them to have to leave their homes, and we're failing to get them in to a landing, either back home, integrated where they are, or relocation to a safe place. I think this is the challenge for IDMC for the next 25 years. In a way, what we've achieved in these 25 years with IDMC at the forefront is to explain to the world, this is a huge problem. It's in our midst, and it's growing. We know the how many, who, from where, the why they fled, and we also know the solutions. What we fail at is to getting the men with guns and power to stop having people flee, and we fail to have all of us become more effective in helping them out of dependence and displacement. I was just recently in Ituri and in northern Kivu. I remember it was among the countries we discussed when this thing started in the 1990s, with Colombia and a few other countries. You go to Eastern Congo today, and has it ever been as bad? I mean, hundreds of thousands of people displaced in the last few months. The UN, which came with a very important mission, I was there when we launched it with Kofi Annan 20 years ago. That mission is leaving. Those who are behind now is an important potential of an East African group of peacekeepers. A Southern African group of peacekeepers will be coming. But the UN is going to be less present. And it's in many ways also a wake-up call for many of the solutions we thought were there were not as easily available as we thought. We will stay and deliver as NRC with 100 other UN agencies, Red Cross, Red Crescent, actors, and NGOs. So will 150 armed groups be. Together we will have to perform better, and we will use IDMC's knowledge, research and recommendations. So that's in a way also my challenge to IDMC colleagues. Help with actionable proposals to the humanitarian actors, to the development actors that IDMC is more and more working with the peace-building actors, which will be there not just in the UN, but also regionally and locally in Africa, Middle East, Latin America, etc. And then hope we can make progress for the people who are there, that IDMC works more and more with local governments and national governments. Fiji and others are here to explain about it. Is a great step in the right direction. When we meet again in some years and celebrate other milestones, I hope we can have made progress in finding the solutions. That is the urgency, and I look forward for all of us to make use of IDMC's and the other experts' proposals and data to make progress for the people in need. I've often called it the Kivu test. If it doesn't really help the women and the children of the Kivus, maybe we shouldn't do it, really. It's not for us to be agreeing. It's for them to get a better life. That's the whole purpose of what we do and what we will discuss today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan, for your words of encouragement, and also for this important reminder that, of course, evidence needs to be as practical and as actionable as possible. Without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Christelle Cazabat for a presentation of our report on 25 years of progress. Thanks.
Thank you, Alexandra. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really feeling privileged today to present the work of my team before so many of our friends and colleagues and partners in the room and online. IDMC, as Alexandra said, would not have achieved so much over the past 25 years without the dedication, the ingenuity, and the talent of its team members. And it's really both an honor and a pleasure to highlight part of their work today. This anniversary report is the result of years of research, monitoring, analysis, and partner engagement. And it brings together the knowledge we have accumulated at IDMC with the expertise of many other organizations and individuals to look back at 25 years of progress on internal displacement, but also take stock of all we must yet achieve together. Since 2020, IDMC has been assessing this progress with our Internal Displacement Index, a composite measure that looks at a country's capacity to address internal displacement through quality information and comprehensive policies, also looks at the scale and impacts of the issue in the country and the context in which it happens. You can access the detailed results of the past 3 editions of the Internal Displacement Index for 46 countries, as well as the full methodology at the end of this report. A few months ago, we released our global report on internal displacement, and we announced that the number of people affected by both conflict and disaster-related displacement had never been so high. Over 71 million people were living in internal displacement at the end of 2022. And as Jan said, this can only mean that the world is not doing enough in terms of presenting, responding to, and ending this major crisis. But rather than raising once again the alarm today and through this report, we wanted to show that solutions are possible and progress within reach. We therefore made every effort to highlight examples of successes from all regions and all displacement contexts. In terms of policies, protection and assistance to affected people, solutions, preparedness and prevention, and of course data. We start with a leap back in time to 1998 and the publication of the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement. They have been and continue to be a reference and an inspiration for policymakers around the world. And they have served as a trigger for many developments over the past 25 years, including the Great Lakes Protocol on the protection and assistance to IDPs in 2006 and the Kampala Convention in 2009. Out of the 46 countries we analyzed through our Internal Displacement Index, only 9 had at least one national level policy framework mentioning internal displacement linked with either conflicts or disasters in 1998. But by now, nearly all of them do. There are comprehensive policies from all regions of the world, and the report highlights a few, including Peru's law on internal displacement and Niger's law on IDPs protection and assistance. Several are remarkable for their efforts to prevent future displacements, include minority groups in solutions, and engage affected communities in their development. But there is room for progress as many countries still lack comprehensive national frameworks to coordinate and plan for the prevention of, the response and solutions to displacement linked with conflicts, violence, disasters, and climate change. The risk of future internal displacement linked with climate change is gaining attention, but the phenomenon is still less addressed in national policies. Only 25 out of the 46 countries we analyzed through our Internal Displacement Index developed related frameworks. Fiji and Vanuatu are 2 leaders in this field, whose efforts for preparedness and community participation are highlighted in our report. New advancements are being made every year, and new laws and policies were adopted last year in Honduras, Mozambique, Nigeria, and Chad. But a common challenge for all affected countries is, however, to translate these words into action. Given the scale and the complexity of internal displacement's root causes and impacts, even the best policy frameworks are rarely matched with sufficient financial, technical, and human resources. It has become clear that nationally led efforts must be supported by the international community. The second chapter of this report looks at the progress made in protecting and assisting IDPs. Several countries have dedicated billions supporting livelihoods, providing services, housing, education, and health facilities for IDPs. Some examples of national authorities' support are highlighted, including Kenya and Colombia, for instance. But here too, while national authorities hold a primary responsibility for the protection of their internally displaced citizens, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, and other stakeholders have played a crucial role in many contexts. The report features, for instance, municipal authorities' efforts in the Ukrainian city of Kherson, photographed here. Urban areas serve as places of refuge and origin for IDPs all over the world, often putting municipal authorities at the front line of response. In many countries, IDPs themselves lead their own initiatives to support their communities. I'll search for successful initiatives on internal displacement, which are then published in our global repository of good practices on IDMC's website, shows that some of the most effective interventions are community-led approaches that center the voices of IDPs and of their host communities. Once immediate needs for protection and assistance are met, longer-term solutions must be found, and IDPs must be supported in either returning home, integrating sustainably in their host community, or relocating in a new home, depending on their preferences and what is possible in each context. Since 2010, The Interagency Standing Committee's framework on durable solutions for internally displaced persons has been guiding local, national, and international efforts in this sense, both in terms of policies and programs. Afghanistan, El Salvador, Niger, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen, for instance, have incorporated the framework into their laws, policies, and strategies on internal displacement. In the Horn of Africa, home to millions of IDPs, regional, national, and subnational durable solutions initiatives have been put in place, using the framework as the reference to guide their work. The framework is also used as the basis for several data initiatives, including by the Expert Group on Refugee, IDP, and Statelessness Statistics, EGRIS, the Government of Colombia, or IDMC's severity assessments that measure IDPs' living conditions. Yet, as I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, more people than ever live in internal displacement, and many of them for months or years. Recognizing the importance of supporting affected countries with global commitment, the UN Secretary General established the High-Level Panel on Internal Displacement in 2019, which conducted extensive consultations with IDPs, host communities, and other stakeholders, and received submissions from more than 100 member states, UN agencies, and NGOs, leading to the publication of a report and later of an action agenda on internal displacement, and also resulting in the appointment of a special advisor on solutions to internal displacement, Mr. Robert Piper, who will give closing remarks today. But the most effective way to end displacement, as Jan mentioned, is to prevent it from happening altogether, or prepare so that its scale, duration, and negative impacts are limited. Our report showcases promising efforts to incorporate prevention measures in national policies, invest in resilience, and in anticipatory action. Most of these examples focus on displacement linked with disasters and climate change, but there is also emerging evidence on successful interventions to reduce conflict-related displacement. 31 out of the 46 countries assessed for the Internal Displacement Index include measures to prevent displacement in their national laws and policies. Innovative approaches have shown promising results in several countries. For instance, addressing the displacement of nomadic herders affected by extreme weather events in Mongolia, and building resilient communities in Somalia. These efforts are being guided by new analysis on the risk of future displacement, but more investments are needed to match the needs for accurate estimates. The World Bank, IFRC, IDMC, the Chima Foundation, ETH Zurich, and the Danish Refugee Council are among the organizations that have put in place initiatives to assess the risk of future displacement linked with disasters, climate change, and conflict. These estimates, however, must rely on existing data on internal displacement. And while this data has much improved since 1998, it remains limited in many ways. In 2001, when IDMC published its first estimates, we had data for 47 countries and only for displacement associated with conflict and violence. Since 2008, we expanded the scope of our monitoring to include disaster displacement and more than tripled the number of countries for which we report figures. This increase in our coverage is the result of growing efforts at the national and global levels to improve knowledge on internal displacement scale, patterns, and impacts. Our estimates rely on multiple sources, from national to subnational authorities to international organizations such as IOM and UNHCR. Nationally led examples, including Colombia's National Registry of Victims and the Philippines Disaster Response Operations Monitoring and Information Center, are highlighted in our report. Global initiatives, like the Expert Group on Refugee, IDP, and Statelessness Statistics, and the Joint IDP Profiling Service and more have also played a crucial role in advocating for and supporting this progress towards better data. The number of countries releasing data on their internally displaced populations keeps increasing. In 2020, the Internal Displacement Index's data indicator showed that only 36 countries out of the 46 we analyzed published or endorsed data on disaster-related displacement, for instance. With this year's update of the index, we found that 45 out of 46 countries now do. But more granular and inclusive data to design and monitor effective interventions is still needed. This graph shows the percentage of countries included in the Internal Displacement Index that publish sex and age disaggregated data on IDPs, grouped by region. As you can see, even in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the region where more disaggregated data is available, only at best half of the countries can rely on such information to tailor their support for internally displaced women and men, boys and girls, children, young and older people. Documenting the duration of displacement, its various impacts on affected people and economies, and the sustainability of returns, local integration or relocation, are also gaps that need urgent filling. Several initiatives are currently ongoing to try and address these next frontiers together. We at IDMC really look forward to continuing our collaboration with our partners and contributing to a more solid evidence base to inform policies, programs, and solutions for internal displacement. I thank you for your attention, and I will now leave the floor to my colleague Vout, Head of External Relations, and to a fascinating panel who can share their more direct perspectives on the many advances I just mentioned. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Excellencies, colleagues, peers, and friends. As Christelle mentioned, I'm Dawn-Marie Vout. I'm the Head of External Relations at IDMC, and I'm really excited to be here today moderating this discussion. What I can say is this promises to be no ordinary panel discussion. In commemoration of 25 years since IDMC's founding, as well as that of the establishment of the guiding principles on internal displacement, we've brought together a fantastic lineup of speakers, highly esteemed, each one holding various levels of experience, and each one that has contributed significantly to advancing progress on the issue of internal displacement. As we just heard from Christelle, who's provided much information in terms of the latest report that IDMC released, looking back on 25 years of progress that's been made in factors such as overall policies, protection, as well as assistance, solutions, preparedness and prevention, as well as data, we now have the opportunity to hear from these speakers what progress means to them and what progress looks like, and also to really look forward at what needs to be done to advance further solutions for the world's 71 million people still living in internal displacement today, which includes, as Jan mentioned, the 62.5 million people that have been displaced by conflict and violence, as well as 8.7 million that are living in a situation of displacement by disasters. On that note, let me introduce our speakers. So to my right sits Mr. Trygve Nordby, who was NRC's Secretary General from 1990 until 1997. In that capacity, Mr. Nordby played an instrumental role in generating political commitment and engagement around the issue of internal displacement. Since then, subsequently, he was also the Secretary General of the European Movement of Norway, as well as the Under-Secretary General of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Welcome, Trygve. Following this, we will hear from Professor Walter Kälin, who is the Professor Emeritus of International and Constitutional Law at the University of Bern. He's also currently the envoy of the chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement. Previously, he was the representative of the UN Secretary General on the human rights of IDPs. Welcome, Walter. In addition, we look forward to hearing from Paula Gaviria, who is the Special Rapporteur on the human rights of IDPs. She's also the Executive Director of COMPAS, a non-profit organization in Colombia serving conflict-affected communities. And she's also was a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on internal displacement, a human rights lawyer with more than 2 decades of experience overall as well. Welcome, Paula. We then look forward to hearing from His Excellency, Mr. Luc Daunivalou, who is the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Fiji to the United Nations in Geneva. Previously, Ambassador Daunivalou was Fiji's High Commissioner to Australia, as well as the Ambassador and Head of the Permanent Mission of Fiji to the United Nations in New York. Welcome, Ambassador. And finally, we look forward to hearing from Sumbul Rizvi, who is the Principal Advisor on Internal Displacement to the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, an Indian national with more than 30 years of experience implementing projects in human rights and humanitarian assistance. She's also an expert when it comes to refugee, IDP, and asylum and migration management. And she's also the chairperson of IDMC's advisory group. Unfortunately for those of us in Geneva, Sumbul will soon be leaving us and taking on a new role in Bangladesh as UNHCR's country representative. So we welcome Sumbul as well. Right before we get started with some of the formal questions and the discussion, I just wanted to go over a few things, just some housekeeping. For those of you joining online, you have the opportunity to ask questions throughout today's discussion. Just please pose them in the Q&A box, and we have colleagues behind the scene that will be monitoring that and responding to some of those questions live while sending some of those questions to the panel. I have my phone here. We'll be checking that during the Q&A session. For those of you joining in person, please just reserve any comments or question you have until the end of today's discussion. So, turning to you, Trygve. Please, can you take us back to the 1990s a little bit? What was the global context like at that time? What were some of the key factors that led you personally and NRC overall to come to the realization that there was a need to monitor and understand internal displacement better?
Okay. Thank you for the invitation, and congratulations. The whole international community, or at least important parts of the international community, started to show more interest in the plight of IDPs at the beginning of the 1990s. And so did the Norwegian Refugee Council. But why did NRC, a traditional refugee NGO, increasingly include internal displaced people in our engagement? Most importantly, it came from the field. It came out of NRC personnel's and partners' observations and concrete work in the field. The change in geopolitics due to the end of the Cold War and the consequent change in many of the ongoing refugee-producing conflicts demanded new ways and opened up for new discussions on humanitarian and human rights frameworks in the search for durable solutions for displaced people. We saw that IDPs had the same needs for assistance, protections, and durable solutions as refugees in exile. Our staff, together with partners, would meet the very same people as refugees, as returnees, maybe as IDPs, again, refugees. I mean, going back and forth over the border. I can remember concretely standing on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan the spring of 1990, and in the very same picture, I could catch refugees fleeing, I could catch refugees repatriating, and IDPs in the very same picture. Same with visits to Mozambique. It was actually described as the refugee situation in Malawi, but the people came from Mozambique. Refugees were described by their presence in exile countries. And another example, Guatemala. we couldn't find out how many IDPs we were to work with inside Guatemala, because we were located in Mexico and the exiled countries around. So the NRC summed up that from our field engagement, we saw a need to, one, move away from one-sided exile perspective and work more actively in the countries of origin, and definitely see the problem from the country of origin. Secondly, engage in cross-border coordination among NGOs and IGOs. It was so much a matter of exile and exile in country by country, not as a problem stemming from maybe an IDP situation in a country of origin. So we needed, as a third need, to get much better IDP documentation for programming, fundraising, and advocacy work. A few words about each of these three. On the operational side, we decided, and I think also UNHCR and many other agencies, made a shift in the early 90s in describing the refugee situations from exile over to describing it from the country of origin. This also gave us much more concrete experience when we took it back to the academic societies or fellow NGOs or UN agencies, because we learned much more about the actual situations. Secondly, on coordination, we had a special interest in division of roles and labor between different actors, governments, IGOs, NGOs, and so on. And we as the NRC, decided to fill in some of these white spots on the map without becoming yet another entity. There are many entities here. So we therefore, through ICVA, International Council of Voluntary Agencies, actually started several coordination projects inside Mozambique, inside Guatemala, inside Bosnia, and so on. And thirdly, on documentation. As you all know, in 1992, Francis Deng got his mandate as the first representative of the UN Secretary General on internally displaced persons. But already in 1993, actually 30 years ago, NRC, in consultations with Deng, took the first initiatives to start a project to gather information and publish an annual report on IDPs, but things take time. So in addition to extensive meetings with UNHCR and other UN organizations, we met with representatives for governments and organizations like IOM, ICRC, IFRC, the World Council of Churches, the Quakers, US Committee for Refugees, donor foundations, and others. This involvement at the international level gave us, NRC, a good opportunity to discuss with key partners the possibility of creating something new, something concrete on better IDP documentation. NRC's legal advisor at the time worked closely with Francis Deng and Roberta Cohen, whom many of you know, at the Brookings Project on internal displacement. And let me, for the record, just mention a couple of publications. In 1994, NRC's legal advisor, Jan Borgen is his name, wrote The Protection of Internally Displaced Persons, Platforms, Concepts and Strategies. It was commissioned by Francis Deng. And in 1995, the same guy, Jan Borgen, together with Elisabeth Rasmussen, whom many of you know, at that time she was our desk for Latin America and active in mapping and understanding internal displacement, especially in Colombia. They wrote a paper, Institutional Arrangements for Internally Displaced People. Another example in case is the Partnership in Action process. This is a good example of how NRC and other NGOs worked at the time. NRC hosted a global conference which took place in Oslo in 1994, based on 6 regional conferences: Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East, Europe, all over the world. We met with hundreds and hundreds of national and local NGOs and discussed the whole relationship between UNHCR and NGOs. So in the Oslo conference, about 250 participants represented more than 100 countries and adopted what is later called the Pernack Oslo Plan of Action. It represents a synthesis of all these discussions. And let me just cite from one of the many, many conclusions. There are 19 conclusions only on IDPs in this plan of action. And it says, and this is 1994, UNHCR and NGOs should explore with the representative of the Secretary General or internally displaced persons potential areas of cooperation in specific situations, such as country-specific information gathering and assisting with country visits by the representative, 1994. This was in the early days of DHA, later OCHA, and the interagency structures, where the IDP issue was given increased attention. Several organizations wanted to play a role, but needed internal go-ahead signals, and not least funding. DHA was quite eager, as I could recall, to get a mandate, while parts of UNHCR was more reluctant to expand their role vis-à-vis IDPs. And this is also about sovereignty. It was, I mean, UNHCR could work in exile with all these refugees, but as they move into the countries, it's a different ballgame with regard to sovereignty. In October 95, the Brookings Institution and Refugee Policy Group project on internal displacement came with their report, Improving Institutional Arrangements for Internally Displaced. It calls for the creation of an information center, and I've underlined this, within the UN system to collect data on serious cases of internal displacement so that informed policy decisions can be made. But in realizing the small possibilities for this to happen, the report also says if it's not feasible to not feasible at present to create an information center within the UN system, then non-governmental organizations should be encouraged to establish such a center outside the UN in collaboration with the representative. NRC picked up this challenge and could already 1 year later, in 1996, launch the initiative to produce a global IDP survey. We had at that time 12 donors for the projects, 6 governments and 6 NGOs, including NRC. And after publishing the global survey in 1998, the Norwegian Refugee Council, through its global IDP project, was encouraged by the humanitarian community to continue the research process by establishing an online mechanism to improve the accessibility of IDP information. And as you all know, and mentioned here, the same year in 1998, Francis Deng presented the guiding principles to the UN Commission on Human Rights. And the rest is really history, important history. But history telling is risky business. The biggest danger is to leave out key people and key institutions. So let me end by stating that in addition to the involvement of the many good colleagues from NRC, a large number of other people and organizations were involved in the discussions of the 1990s on how to better meet the plight of internally displaced persons. But my main point stands. It all started with the needs observed from the field. So my best advice to the continuation of the IDMC story is let the needs at field level continue to guide your initiatives and priorities. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Trygve. It was a really interesting overall history. And as an IDMC staff member for the last 7 years, I always find it interesting to hear the genesis of how IDMC came about. And also incredibly important to note some of the same things that we seem to be grappling with today when it comes to issues of national sovereignty. You mentioned coordination, of course, protection overall. So thank you so much for that. Just moving on now to Professor Kälin. Trygve has taken us up until the period of 1998 when we established the guiding principles on internal displacement and IDMC as the global IDP project at the time. So now I'd like to ask you if you could come to the present moment, but look back 25 years and consider what you think were the main areas of achievements that we've made in the last 25 years on internal displacement, and if you feel that there are any opportunities as well looking forward that can really serve as game changers to help us resolve or prevent future displacement.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much IDMC for all the work done. Congratulations for the 25 years hard work. When back in 2004 I became the representative of the UN Secretary General on internal displacement, donors asked me to conclude an MOU with IDMC, together then also with Dennis McNamara at OCHA. And I think this started a very long-standing and continuing friendship. Yes, we are also celebrating 25 years of the guiding principles. At that time, Francis Deng had asked me, and I had the honor and pleasure to chair the small group of experts that supported him in drafting the guiding principles. And of course, we were all very excited when in early 1998 he submitted the document to the then Human Rights Commission, now the Human Rights Council. But the reception was anything than a warm welcome. Some countries criticized him for standard setting behind their backs. The Human Rights Commission decided to only take note of the guiding principles. In a non-diplomatic message, this means, yes, this document is a fact, but we don't like it. So, we have come a long way since then. And what were important milestones? And I'm focusing on the more normative level, because time is short and limited. I think the first milestone really was the 2005 World Summit. This was a big gathering of all the heads of states and government. And in that document, the Millennium Outcome document, is an important paragraph. Governments unanimously there recognize the guiding principles as, and I quote, an important international framework for the protection of internally displaced persons. They also expressed, and I quote again, their resolve to take effective measures to increase the protection of internally displaced persons. So this non-legally binding document received that kind of approval, and since then there are numerous resolutions, declarations by the UN General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, other bodies, always adopted by consensus that repeat exactly that language. An important international framework for the protection of IDPs. Second milestone, transforming these guiding principles, being legally non-binding, into hard law. This happened in Africa. In 2006, the guiding principles were transformed into a legally binding document in the so-called Great Lakes Protocol on the Protection and Assistance to IDPs, adopted by the International Conference on the Great Lakes region. This was an attempt, Jan, you were talking about that region. At that time, it was a hope that there would be peace. Of course, we see the realities. Yes, in some countries, big progress made, but not everywhere if you're turning to Ituri. But anyway, the document provided said that the states parties have the obligation to adopt and implement the guiding principles. And then 2009, the Kampala Convention. The Kampala Convention, in a way, transforming the rights of IDPs into obligations of states and other actors, because the Kampala Convention is simply about obligations. And that's important. It's good to be a rights bearer, but if there is no duty holder, then that's an empty promise. Next important step, and we already heard about it, all the investments, but also the progress made in terms of elaborating, adopting national laws, policies, and strategies. And I don't need to repeat the numbers that Christelle represented to us. And the good thing is, yes, many of these instruments are not perfect, but more and more, and particularly if you're looking at the more recent one, they are really in line with the international standards. Incorporate, as has been mentioned, the guiding principle, but also the 8 elements for the durable solutions of the ISC framework on durable solutions. And then a little bit in the same way, and very often overlooked, and if I would ask the questions if you were my students, I wouldn't get many responses, but it's important. In fact, the guiding principles have been invoked time and again, not enough, but still by UN treaty bodies, by regional human rights courts, and by national courts. Talking about the very important decision by the Constitutional Court of Colombia, also celebrating next year, 25 years. But then also looking at what, for instance, the UN Rights Committee recommended to states in terms of adopting laws and strategies for assisting, protecting IDPs, to do more to find durable solutions. The European Court of Human Rights, in one decision concluding that under the European Human Rights Convention, and I quote, "The authorities have the primary duty and responsibility to establish conditions as well as provide the means that allow IDPs to achieve durable solutions." That's the primary responsibility of governments. That's governments in the lead. And the Inter-American Court, talking about reparation for victims of arbitrary displacement and giving very clear orders to the governments what to do to help them to rebuild their lives. Huge potential, not sufficiently used by activists, by NGOs, by organizations. And then finally, of course, yes, the current momentum with the high-level panel report and the Secretary General's action agenda, but we will hear more about that from Robert Piper. So we do have reasons to celebrate, but I must admit I'm more and more concerned about whether we are really on track. Why? Just 3 points. First, of course, we have what we could call, or what academics would call, the policy turn towards development-oriented approaches, the nexus. But in reality, we're still too much focused on humanitarian approaches to solutions, sometimes even prevention. And what we leave out is, again, the primary responsibility of governments. IDPs are their citizens. IDPs are right holders. And we haven't really integrated that perspective into our approaches, into our systems. So it's too easy for governments just to delegate it to UNHCR and others. Second concern and worry is we still lack clear institutional anchoring at the international level. Of course, we don't have one UN agency, and probably it would be a bad idea to have just one agency in charge of the problem. Of course, we have all the organizations working on internal displacement issues from their perspective, humanitarian action, human rights, development, peace building, disaster risk reduction, we have made progress on that. But as one academic, Anne Koch, recently found, and I quote her, the fact that each actor involved is firmly rooted in one of these dimensions results in an empty middle in institutional terms. Yes, empty. If you're looking at other policy areas, we either have an organization, such as UNHCR for refugees, with a clear mandate and responsibility, or we have a convention providing for follow-up mechanisms. Take the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the climate conferences, the COPs, or we have a soft law instrument with a follow-up process. Look at the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Refugee Forum, which will come up towards the end of the year, or the GCM is the same thing. And we don't really have any fora where IDPs and internal displacement and also the fate of displacement-affected communities can be discussed in a regular way, where there are opportunities for pledges. I very much hope that out of the present efforts to implement the action agenda of the Secretary General and the high-level event next year, something like this will come out. Whatever the solution is, we do need a better institutional anchoring that brings together the different stakeholders with the governments. And of course, if we don't have these institutional frameworks, then we have weak or limited accountability, one of the key findings of the high-level panel report. Yes, I could continue, but let me stop here. The message is, Paula, a lot of work.
Thank you very much. It's really, again, interesting to look back on what constitutes progress in the last 25 years, but I think nobody can argue that the task ahead on addressing the growing numbers of internally displaced people is indeed daunting. Therefore, I'd like to now turn to Paula, indeed, as a special rapporteur on the human rights of IDPs, and use the segue you already provided for us a little bit on the example of Colombia, Walter. And Colombia, of course, is often cited as providing a positive overall example in its efforts for addressing internal displacement and putting systems in place to do so. So Paula, could you please describe some of the lessons from Colombia or elsewhere that also you're able to use in to assist in the implementation of your mandate, as well as supporting other countries?
Thank you, Dawn, and thank you, IDMC, for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be in this very distinguished panel and in this hotel that brings me so many memories. Walter, Alex, you might remember, Greta. I just remembered then it was colder. Today is really, really hot. But I'm so glad to be here with all of you, and encouraged also to be working alongside partners like IDMC that work tirelessly to shine a light on internal displacement. Thank you for your work. And as Walter said, it's wonderful also to celebrate and to see this relationship that Walter shared with us before of the mandate and IDMC. It's a long-standing working relationship that has only been useful for the implementation of the guiding principles. All the quality data analysis and expertise that you have brought have been crucial for the implementation of the guiding principles. And now turning to the question, Dawn, it's true that Colombia is also often cited as a positive example or as a promising, how do you call it in the report? Promising practice, yeah. And I always feel very encouraged by that. I want to mention here at least three of those maybe reference to Colombia's process. One is that we were one of the first countries that in 1997, before the guiding principles, with all this history that was brought to us here today, that adopted a comprehensive framework for internal displacement people protection that was expanded upon in a legislation in 2011 with the landmark victims law that recognize IDPs as victims also of human rights violations with the consequence of being entitled as well to reparations. That's like the first landmark of Colombia. And the second, I would say, Walter already mentioned, the Constitutional Court's monitoring and defining of a methodology for evaluating the government's compliance with the IDP laws with an index of concrete indicators that next year has its 20th anniversary. And then I would say the role of the Colombian civil society. I come from there, so I know how we have struggled, but I also remembering all and sharing all this past of the Colombian civil society behind even the church. The church had a registry before this, the Catholic Church had a registry with NGOs before even the state start building that registry. So we owe a lot to civil society, Colombian civil society organizations. But despite these good examples, still significant challenges are here, and lasting change for millions of IDPs is still to be seen. And I would say that only acknowledging some of these missteps that Colombia has made along the way, we can draw lessons to share for other crises in the world. And now, being a special rapporteur, I see that with more perspective. I am called to take like a little step ahead or to the side, and I see Colombia's case with different lenses now. And I would say, and I would like to share with you some of those lessons learned from the practice of the Colombian experience. So, yes, it's true, we passed a law back in 1997. We are proud of that. But the budget to implement the law was limited. There were no clear lines of responsibility. So the ability of the government to provide protection and assistance was stalled. So that brings us to the first lesson. Establishing an IDP law is crucial. It's hard. It's difficult to do it. But it's not enough. Once a law is passed, there is a need for strategies and action plans that are evidence-based, well-resourced, and with clear responsibilities across the whole of government so the law can be implemented. So clarity of responsibilities within the government must also be matched with dedicated engagement with other actors, such as the development actors and organizations and the private sector, so that their potential added value is better utilized. And we didn't take that into account in the Colombia process. At the beginning, I'm very happy that the special advisor on solution and his team is really pushing Colombia now to engage the other actors and to be on board. The second lesson is on the value of establishing monitoring and accountability mechanisms. And it doesn't have to involve only the courts. It's also about the national human rights institutions. It's mainly about civil society. I would stress that it's also about IDP-led organizations that should be empowered to be the ones that have a voice on that monitoring and accountability. A key part of the lesson from the Colombian experience is that the national accountability mechanisms are important right from the beginning. In Colombia, it was only 7 years after the law that the court started to monitor this, and then with the victims law, we created a different set of mechanisms, and I would just reiterate that the most important was the institutionalized participation tables from the IDPs themselves. We have many other mechanisms to monitor progress, but that's, for me, the most important one. There are other lessons around balancing the need to provide emergency assistance with more solutions-oriented support for IDPs, and especially on involving IDPs in the definition of those solutions from the beginning. I would say that the approach Colombia had, and I could say still has a little bit, was of treating IDPs as beneficiaries, not as citizens and right holders, and that makes a whole difference in the way responses come and the laws are implemented. But I wanted to focus a little bit in the 1 minute that I have left on the peace, the issue of peace, often overlooked in the triple nexus. And I think that Colombia, addressing the needs of the IDPs as victims of conflict, has been a key actor in the element of having that voice in the peace process between the FARC and the government, and the centrality of the victims in the negotiations and now in the implementation process. I see it as a key part of the reconstruction of the country, reconciliation process in the country. And they now have a special seat. Victims of conflict have a special seat in Congress, and their voices as peace builders are being heard. And as a special rapporteur, one of the top priorities that I have for my mandate is to promote the meaningful engagement and inclusion of displaced populations in mediation process, peace process, transitional justice mechanisms, which is not often the case. And their lack of inclusion represents a critical missed opportunity, in my perspective, to promote sustainable peace and solutions for IDPs. This interlinked work on peace and solutions must be centered around the peoples themselves, IDPs, local communities, human rights institutions, and others across the whole of society approach. As IDMC's new report highlights, our projects and initiatives are likely to deliver better and longer-lasting results when they involve substantially community engagement and empowerment, including to address challenging issues like mental health and social cohesion. The rallying cry of many refugees, led organizations, nothing about us without us, is just as essential for IDPs, who are all, after all, citizens, most of the part of the countries in which they are displaced. Their lives may be in the limbo, but they are working every day to take steps forward and have the best ideas themselves to know what is needed. So as a mandate holder, when I'm looking at situations for IDPs around the world, and I'm going to start my missions next Friday to 3 countries, I'll be looking at these challenges all the time. And I can stress enough how much I have and will continue to rely on IDMC's compilation of data, analysis, and reporting throughout my mandate. The way you present reality, it's always with hope. I have to say it. Reading the report, I highlighted, I read it twice. It's always with hope. It's always sharing and comparing experiences within countries and with others, but always to see how to work better collectively as the only way possible. So you show as well that reality is not static, it's dynamic, and a promising experience and practice today could be a missed opportunity tomorrow. So it's also an opportunity to accept that we have made a lot of mistakes and maybe taking too much time to accept them. So congratulations again for these 25 years of remarkable work and to shining a light on internal displacement. And there is, of course, much work to do. I also see the glass half full, but I'm grateful that we have the opportunity to work each alongside through this journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paula. I particularly appreciate the comment that you made about the fact that having a policy is not alone enough. It requires a dedicated budget. It requires evidence-based dedicated engagement overall and clear lines of accountability. And in addition, your point about the lack of bringing in peace, the angle of peace and peace actors. And it's true that IDMC over the last several years, we've really been working hard to bring in the development actors, but we've also begun to realize the last few years that we can't forget the peace angle as well to this overall nexus equation. So thank you for bringing that up. Moving on, Ambassador Daunevalu. We've just heard from Paula, really interesting examples coming from Colombia, which of course poses one of the biggest displacement challenges historically that the world has seen when it comes to conflict. And Fiji has often been at the forefront in the Pacific overall and across the globe in planning and addressing internal displacement in the context of disasters. Could you please give a few examples of promising practices from Fiji or from elsewhere in the Pacific that you feel could be replicated elsewhere?
Well, thank you, Don, and let me just say how privileged I am to be part of this esteemed panel. It's been quite interesting and illuminating to hear just the genesis and how the work has progressed over the past 25 years to where we are now. And, you know, the future is bright. And I think it's something that is urgent, as we often say when it comes to issues like this. But it's so encouraging just to hear how much work has been done and how much we are coming together to address the work that remains, which is massive. But the report, well done to IDMC and the work that has been done by all partners and friends to get us to where we are. And although I'll be sharing Fiji's experience, but it is reflective to a large degree of the Pacific experiences when it comes to internally displaced persons due to natural disasters or climate change. But some of the things that we have had to grapple with to address our own unique challenges are being helped to a large extent by the work of IDMC in terms of data, in terms of the collaboration that are needed. So one of the things in terms of the positive experiences that we can share with other regions, with other countries, is the formulation of policies. And I heard what you mentioned, Paula, about the policies that needs to be implemented, that needs to be owned and put into practice by all stakeholders. But that's really also the starting point of harnessing all the different experiences and all the different challenges so that everyone starts on the same page to address the issues that we face. So having a national displacement policy in Fiji was a big achievement. The National Planned Relocation Guideline helped us to bring coherence into this national effort of people who have been displaced by climate change and natural disasters. But then putting in place a displacement guideline, and then more recently having the climate change displacement trust fund legislated by our parliament, by our government. These different pieces of policies and laws are bringing a greater focus, a sharper focus to the different stakeholders working together. But talking about IDMC and its role in helping us refine the data, inform our actions and the activities that we have ahead of us. The importance of collaborating governments and partners in addressing displacement. And we have these national instruments, but they need to be put together with a common regional framework. And that's where the collaboration between IDMC, IOM, and the PDD, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, Professor Kälin is here. And we've worked together to bring some cohesion across the Pacific region through a Pacific response to disaster displacement. And this is informative for the countries of not just the Pacific, but for other countries with similar features and are grappling with displacement due to disasters and climate change. But the other positive aspect that we have found that has worked is the actual relocation of populations and communities who have been affected by climate change, and particularly slow onset events like sea level rise. And the government in Fiji has relocated 3 and working on 2 others currently. But we have over 40 other communities that are in urgent need of relocation. And the cost is exorbitant, is huge. And so collaboration in that regard is also vital and essential, and we're looking for partners to do that. The first 3 have all been at the Fijian government's expense. The first one was over $1 million US dollars, money which is being put to relocation that could have been used for other national priorities. But it's essential work that we find is vital to take our communities out of harm's way. And it's an adaptation measure that we are utilizing. And it's a community relocation initiative that we found has worked and is necessary, but it comes with its own challenges and demands, and particularly looking at that initiative of relocating communities as a last resort. But the other aspect that we found and find is very helpful for us is this rural housing initiative. Part of our Building Back Better is to build infrastructure, build houses, hospitals, and roads that can withstand, in our experience, Category 5 cyclones. And these are things that we know we can't always control, but building strong infrastructure, building our rural houses to the standards and the category that can withstand the intense tropical cyclones is helping us also avoid part of the displacement that occurs because of climate change. And we're asking houses and families to move from their shacks and their sheds into community halls that were not built according to withstand Category 5 cyclones. But now with the Rural Housing Initiative, we are helping families stay in their own houses and not having to flee in the last moment because of strong winds or storm surges into a community hall. But part of, and that's in the rural areas, but in the urban centers, we've had to deal with informal settlements and squatter settlements. And so in helping families and communities live in better structures, better houses, have better infrastructure, we are avoiding that drift and the movement into urban centers. But in the urban areas themselves, the government is working on addressing informal settlements through upgrading of facilities and through the formalization program, things like ownership of their own titles and lands and helping to build houses for them. Some of the things that we have worked on that are helpful for us, which we can share with other countries and with other regions of the world.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Ambassador Darnivalu. I think some of the points that you highlighted are really interesting, including you mentioned the formation of policies, but the fact that the Fijian government also created the Displacement Climate Change Trust Fund to help support that. But then in the aspect that, of course, after having moved 3 communities with relocation process, the costs that come with that for a low-income country, and the need then, I would assume, with my fundraising hat on, of international funders to come in and to provide support for that as well. The Rural Housing Initiative, I think, is the first we've heard of an example of prevention overall as well, and preparedness. So that's also really interesting. So thank you for those examples. Moving forward, I know we're running a little bit short on time, but hopefully we can go over a little bit. Sumbul, I'd like to ask you, given your experience working with UNHCR over the years, what do you think are some of the critical elements that lead to success in preventing and responding to internal displacement?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Firstly, Jan, Alexandra, and IDMC, all of you IDMC, on behalf of my own organization, UNHCR, for the collaboration consistently, but also on my behalf, especially as I've been part of the IDMC's advisory group, and that's been a very close relationship, and thank you really very much. Now, sitting with this very luminary panel, all the issues have been raised. So I think we could have done without this particular speech. But let me just take advantage of where I'm sitting. I think I can draw out, in the angle that you've asked me from a practitioner's agency angle on the ground, I think 3 main issues that really come out, which would be partially repetitive in terms of broad principles, but it's good enough to repeat them, and then I can give some examples. Number 1 would be partnerships. Partnerships is absolutely critical. There is no way we can work without working together. And if anyone is under the illusion of doing so, then they can set off, because it'll be towards the sunset. It's togetherness that can actually bring us where we are, and those are the examples that have been provided on how we have together collectively moved forward. There's still more work required on that, but that's one. The second point that I would have, and then I'll come back to some examples, is that data goes beyond determining the numbers and locations. And when we are talking about an IDP spectrum, forced displacement spectrum, we are talking about a range of data. So that's another one. And the last for me is again something that has been said, but I would like to give some examples eventually, is IDPs themselves. as people with their own agency, with their own sort of desires and interests. And it set me off when Jan started this conversation with the example of the Ituri region and the Kivus. The majority of the IDPs, 90% of the IDPs, have always been hosted by local communities. But now when the numbers are so massive, we have to look at the communities as well. So it's the people. And Paula, you drew that out as well. So going back to point number one on collaborations and partnerships, from UNHCR's point of view, there is no other way. And I realize everybody obviously agrees with that. We have had a long-standing partnership, of course, and you gave some examples, Trygve, of the past as well, and it's been over 5 decades that UNHCR has been working on internal displacement, but together with everybody else. And we count agencies, and I can give a whole list of names of agencies, there's no point in that. But the key is the national authorities. And national authorities are not just the capital authorities, they're also the local municipalities, the mayors, the local communities who are actually hosting or very often in the eye of the storm themselves with not having displaced but impacted directly. So it's that range, and local NGOs and civil society you mentioned as well. It is in that spirit that we have such a diverse advisory group at IDMC, where someone like me could be a chair of that advisory group. And I think it's the beauty of that conversation that we bring together with not pushing our agency agenda, so to speak, but actually looking at things in togetherness. And that's fantastic and good going on that one with all of us. A very strong collaboration, and I'd specifically try to note that UNHCR has had with IDMC per se. We align today our global trends report with IDMC figures. And there's a lot of hard work, colleagues, that has gone into that, country by country, year by year. And it's sometimes a struggle, sometimes it's easier in some contexts, but it's an effort. And unless you keep the objective of collaboration in your mind together, it's easy to give up and say, forget it. You know, let's just go with our figures. How many of us as decision makers might have been forced to make those decisions? But it's that effort, I think that's critical and must be acknowledged, as that is what brings us to look at things together with the same lens. And then we've, of course, done many joint workshops. We did something in CAR together with IDMC and GIPS, working group in Somalia, to facilitate interoperability of the IDP data collection. That is a key word, interoperability. How do we all read, manage, understand the data to be able to use it in different ways, depending on what our mandates are? And coming into that, efforts to include IDPs in national statistical systems in Colombia, Honduras, Iraq, Somalia, just mentioned, Ukraine, and Mexico. And those are clear efforts that have been recent, in fact. Our work with the Joint IDP Profiling Service as well has been critical, and there are many country examples that we have on that. It has been co-hosted by UNHCR since 2009, and supporting locally owned information and analysis through profiling. A very important point that was made throughout, but goes back to partnerships, is national ownership. And we keep saying it, but what does it really mean? Now, existing methodologies, since 2016, we're all aware, the EGRIS, the Expert Group on Refugees, IDPs, and Stateless Statistics, which basically has 57 member countries and multiple agencies, is hosted by UNHCR. And it furthers the whole concept of national ownership, but going back to the point of whole of government approach, because it's not just that statistical office that you are engaging with, but what it brings in terms of diverse ministries, departments of governments, which come together and look at the issue of forced displacement from a larger and a wider angle, including in a local context. And that, I think, is beautiful. We should grow it. We should all work together to grow this so it goes beyond the 57 member countries that it has, and has more member countries that are part of this. It has 36, I think, regional and international organizations also as a part of it. There are many key achievements over there, and I don't need to dwell on those, but essential to note that aspect of building national capacity is critical, and let's use the existing instruments and further strengthen them. This has also led to international recommendations, specifically on IDP statistics, that there's a recent national recommendation on that, international recommendation. And it's that implementation that we're all working towards. So again, something that has been created, but it has to be taken forward together. I should also note the Joint Data Centre, which UNHCR and the World Bank jointly established in 2019. And this Joint Data Centre, there's sometimes an illusion that it only looks at refugees. I should point out 45% of its caseload, of its work, is IDPs. And that's something we together own and work with a multitude of other organizations. It brings together resources and capacities to enable sustainable change by improving the evidence basis for national policy, of course, development and amongst development and humanitarian organizations. In fact, the JDC, as a very specific objective, also supports the EGRIS, which I just mentioned, financially and with technical expertise for standard setting and for expansion of national statistical offices and so on. We've also recently signed, actually just this June, an agreement with the World Bank on global data sharing framework. And that's another one that we're excited to see in terms of implementation on how we can build on existing data partnerships and quicker access to socioeconomic related data so that the World Bank can design targeted programs that build economic resilience and individual potential and inform our own assistance delivery. We've, of course, had a very close working relationship with the Special Rapporteur on the human rights of IDPs through the various iterations that we've had. And Paula, we look forward to further working more closely with you. Going to point number 2, on data goes beyond determining the number and locations. It's about context, it's about demographics, it's about broader information on environmental, political, and socioeconomic dynamics, as well as associated trends. There is no clear divide about these are the countries where you have climate or disaster-related displacements, and those are the countries where you have conflict. It's all mixed up. So we've got to understand and be able to read through the tea leaves on that one, in terms of forecasting, but also in terms of our own preparedness and response. Qualitative data has the capacity to produce more nuanced insights into sensitive issues. And those sensitive issues that I refer to are protection issues, are issues of survival. And they have to be looked at together and not just as gender-based violence or child protection. It's the entirety of the community and their issues that have to be looked at. And therefore, protection analysis is in UNHCR considered a key. And this is something we're working to building further on to support evidence-informed advocacy, programming by whoever, not just agencies, but also government departments, and monitoring and service delivery. You are aware about the Global Protection Cluster analysis that has been done starting, I think, a few years ago, but several countries have been covered in that process, and we are looking forward to boosting it even further. And as UNHCR hosts the Global Protection Cluster, we would be really keen to move it further with possibly interoperability of data that other agencies collect and see how we can work together on it. And NRC is an integral part of the Global Protection Cluster. So looking forward to more work on that. Now, advancing efforts towards solutions requires further improvements to available socioeconomic data, which has to be disaggregated and contextualized in the same vein. To highlight the vulnerabilities, but also to highlight preferences, skills, and capacities, because we are looking at people not just as people who need something, but people who can do something as well for themselves, because they have been doing things for themselves, maybe not in the same way, but further on. And that supports solutions, and I'm sure Robert's going to speak more concretely about this. Protection analysis is also critical to do this, but also to ensure a do no harm approach, which to IDP solutions as well, because we are attracting a range of stakeholders to come in and work on IDP solutions as well. But everyone doesn't necessarily understand things from the point of view of a protection lens. And I took note of what Walter said about our IDP work is still more engaging of humanitarian actors. I would also add humanitarian methodologies. We need to move beyond that. We need to move into the sphere and realm which is not necessarily panned out already. And that's where, as UNHCR, we believe that the work we try to do, and together with many of you, on building refugee solutions as a part of a seamless approach to refugee response has an experience that we could look at also and move better with. Last, on the issue of engagement with IDP communities and IDPs themselves, but other affected communities. People who may never have fled because they're just so bottom of the pile, absolutely unable to even pick themselves up and flee, or the ones who have received the large number of IDPs. Understanding their needs, their issues is extremely important. And you can't just do it as a little survey here and there. It needs to be a full understanding of the communities. Within UNHCR, we've had a long-standing, I think I've been 25 years with UNHCR and I've seen it since, is the age gender diversity mainstreaming, as we call it, where you have to split population groups into disaggregated methodologies and interview them, talk to them, understand them, and do it in a multifunctional way, which means not just a protection officer going and interviewing them, but the program officers and other colleagues who bring other angles of our work of delivery and assistance, also being a part of that process, because that draws out the variety and the range of issues and perspectives that you will actually see for yourselves when you're doing it together and in a broad, open-ended way, so to speak. So I can actually go on, but I think I'll just stop there. But thank you all very much, really, and I look forward to tomorrow for the meeting as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sumbul. Just highlighting a few of the points that you made, because there are too many for me to maybe zoom in on all of them, but certainly I know the colleagues from IDMC will really appreciate that you mentioned the alignment of the global trends with our global report data as well. I know they work really hard behind the scene on doing that, as do the colleagues at UNHCR. So the importance of partnerships, of course, we really feel and we really promote as well at IDMC. And then you also mentioned the importance of strengthening the capacity at a national level, which we also, of course, couldn't agree more with. And thank you for highlighting initiatives such as EGRIS for improving monitoring and reporting overall on displacement. And then, of course, going beyond the numbers when it comes to collecting data on socioeconomic data that will help us really understand what are the needs of the IDP populations as well, and how to tailor assistance according to those needs appropriately. We are definitely a little bit late, but I would still like to open up the opportunity to ask some questions from the floor. I'm going to put my glasses on because I'm also getting older, and not only that, it's just difficult to see with these lights coming at us. So,
Yeah,
but before,
it's a bit blinding.
I'd like to give initially to His Excellency Ambassador Endresen from Norway to give some remarks.
Oops.
Well, thank you very much, and I think I'll start by a little bit of congrats and sort of commending you for your achievements throughout 25 years. Thanks to you, we have a precise impression of the problem that we have in front of us, and we are able to make informed policy decisions because of the tireless work of IDMC. So that's already a great accomplishment that you should take pride in. But I think the question that sort of lingers with me after having heard all of you is that one, we know now what we have to deal with. Two, we need to get down to the action. And I recall NDRC representatives putting exactly that test forward, saying that the requirement is the following: what does it matter in the field? So I'm glad that we're moving on to solutions. I think that's the discussion we need to have. And I hear from experiences from Fiji and Colombia that it's really a question of the action and policies of the nation states, the affected countries, as you say. So the question that sort of comes to me is, what can we do to incentivize nation states to do whatever necessary in basket number one to sort of alleviate the problem once they have it, and importantly in basket number two, to prevent IDP situations from arising. And on this particular point, I think it's true what some people have said, that the peace and conflict aspect to this is important, as in Colombia, because even if climate is a very important driver that will probably just increase, conflict is today the driver of most of the IDP situations. We really need to put an effort on sort of how to avoid and deal with conflict as a driver. But first and foremost, congrats, and I'm very happy to represent the country that has stood by you in all of these 25 years. Well done.
Great, thank you. I think it's a really important question, so maybe we can start with this question to the panel, and then we'll open up for just one or two other questions, because we definitely need to leave a little bit of time for Robert Piper to give his concluding remarks as well. So in terms of providing incentive to states overall, it's a question I think we've asked over and over, and it comes back to national sovereignty as well. Lots of issues here. I don't want to call on you unbeknownst, but maybe I can.
No, I'll just start with something that we worked in the high-level panel, and there's like this notion of the cost of inaction. So that's like the best incentive, and countries don't see that. Yeah. And I could see it in my own perspective from Colombia. The cost of not addressing the issue, even though we had the law, in the right moment, it's been outrageous. So that's the first thing I would say, but I know Walter has more to say.
Well, that's one aspect. The other aspect we highlighted in the high-level panel report is, of course, you need political will, and sometimes that's absent for political reasons. But very often, the political will is weak because governments realize that they could not implement what they promise, meaning that they lack the capacity or sufficient capacity and the resources. So I think we do look at all of that in a comprehensive way. We need a political dialogue, but at the same time, we need also predictability at the level of the international community when it comes to capacity building support and also the necessary resources and necessary financial report. And if, for instance, when we're talking about development-oriented approaches to solutions, we do not have predictable financing systems yet in the area of development financing. We, again, do not have the institutional frameworks at the global level that would allow for having these kind of discussions and also to interact with the governments. So for me, it's never black and white. Well, there are some bad cases where it's black and white, but in many, many cases, you would have much better chances to have the government in the lead if we would do more on our side.
Can I just add, institutional framework, certainly, and that's what Fiji is working on, getting the policy framework, getting the legislative, legal framework, and the institutions to work together. But it's not as forthcoming in terms of the assistance, the collaboration, the partnership that is needed to help finance relocation of communities. We've shared the experiences that we are going through in regional forums, here in the Human Rights Council, in the different multilateral forums. And we've not been reserved or conservative in sharing some of the positive things that we're doing, opening our borders to the countries of Tuvalu, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, should they go underwater in whenever the next few decades or years, in the hope that other countries can do the same. We don't have much land, but we can incentivize, but the uptake is not there. So we can share our experiences, we can share best practices, but the political will, I think, is where it comes down to. We have legal frameworks in place and policies, and we have institutions. But again, there needs to be a stronger political buy-in to establish more collaboration and partnership to countries who are on the front lines.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to take a question from the online participants. I've been checking my phone, not because I'm messaging, but because I'm actually looking from the colleagues that are working behind the scenes and sending some questions to the panel. So this question is for Walter and Paula. As former members of the high-level panel, what progress have you observed in countries to implement the recommendations since the adoption of the UN Secretary General's Action Agenda?
Or for Robert.
Yes.
We say? I think the momentum is there and the awareness is there. I think that it's not for us to say, but I think we did a good job. Walter, don't you think? I think the recommendations are clear and the action agenda has absorbed the main ones, and the implementation that has been going and moving forward by the special advisor has also raised awareness in the countries. There's like a more clear route and pathway for countries to address, at least in this case, the protractedness of displacement, which was the main approach that we had in the high-level panel. So I think it's there, but it won't be there forever. I think it's been 3 years and a half since we started the panel, 1 and something after the recommendations, and you have 1 year ahead, Robert. So there is a lot more to be done in this year, and to keep concrete actions, responses. As the ambassador said, it's not only about having the law, but getting everyone involved, getting all the local actors involved. And, but I think we're on the right track. I think it has had an impact, and it has good responses from the international community and from the states that have this phenomenon crisis.
If I just may add from my recent practical experience, I've been supporting the governments in Sudan and in Niger in developing durable solutions strategies. And I must say that the messages from the high-level panel report resonated very well with the governmental counterparts. Of course, we know what happened in the 2 countries. But in terms of, yes, developing those texts, I felt there was a change of approach, a change of thinking on the side of the governmental counterparts, and we, at that level of text, really made progress. And it's really very, very tragic and sad what's happening now in these 2 countries.
Thank you. We can maybe take one more question from the floor, and then I would like to give just a few minutes to let all the speakers give some quick concluding remarks before then we hand over to Mr. Piper. Yes, the gentleman here. Maybe if you could just introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Riyad Bazia. I'm still involved with the International Civil Society in the UN since a while, even if I did a short time as a consultant. But following the intervention of the ambassador of Norway, yes, this year also it is 25 years after Brundtland report about sustainable development. And just today, another international meeting started on sustainability and finance. But yes, IDC and 25 years later, it is thanks to Rome Statute. Rome Statute adopted in 1998. It's a very important tool in the international law. Since then, 4 years later, in short term, after the ratifications, it gives another international organizations, ICC, International Criminal Court, and IFRC become more than a federation, and accord de siège, and 2 international organizations, ICRC, IFRC, and the humanitarian law. But I want to, yes, and the former permanent representative of Fiji, basically attorney, and now she left Geneva and she's affiliated in ICC. But let me formulate questions. You ask me about questions, because we are criticizing every time this international organization, ICC, such as those others tribunals or courts, special tribunals, court on Lebanon didn't take into account internal displacement in Iraq. Also, but how do you see the future of ICRC? Because we're still talking about the reform in ICC, International Criminal Court, but since we reformed the Human Rights Commission Council and still, but do you think that internal displacement is also a determinated tool for the ICC reform? But we are just experts when thinking about that. Yes, state members matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's diverting just a little bit from the topic today, but I would welcome, we have a cocktail reception after the formal overall event, to come and to speak to any of, I believe all the speakers will be staying for a little bit, to ask some specific questions, but I think for now we'd want to stick to the internal displacement at IDMC.
I could provide a very short answer. I think it has nothing to do with the ICC reform, because the law is there. Arbitrary displacement under several headings is already an international crime. So it's again the question of implementation. It's not the question of the law. And if you look at the legal literature, including my recent book, then you will see a lot of references to these criminal provisions.
Great. Thank you very much, Walter. I know we're really out of time, but I did want to give you all the opportunity to just give a couple of concluding remarks, and maybe we can focus it around one thing, and specifically, if possible, but keeping those closing remarks to 1-2 max minutes, if possible. What more, if you were to give advice to the international community overall, what more can we do to really effectively turn the tide on internal displacement? And maybe we start with Sumbul this time.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Well, I think I made some of those points which would apply, but in addition, I would say let us pull out a few examples. And I know, Walter, you tried to do that with those 2 countries and more, a few more, but sadly the political context went the other way. So this teaches us a lesson that we need to expand the base of the countries that we are actually looking at and trying to work with together, and showcase real examples of where things can work through the course. And that course goes to funding and to actually helping the government boost it, the government's political will, matching with the international support and all of that. And that is a confidence booster that I would see, which would show that we are not really interfering in the sovereign affairs of a state, but rather helping the state to actually implement what it is also interested in doing.
Great. Thank you. Ambassador Downey-Valou.
I would add, the report mentions durable solutions. Indeed, it's essential because we have enduring challenges. Climate change and natural disasters will continue to increase, and the intensity will continue to go up, which will overwhelm, and already is overwhelming, the capacities of governments, humanitarian actors, and stakeholders to not just prevent, prepare, but also to respond to these challenges. In our case, for countries that are being populations that are being displaced not by conflict but by natural disasters. Already we are. So we need durable solutions, and a key part of that is maintaining the partnership and the collaboration regardless of the political climate. And I think communities are in dire need of that. Governments will change, but we need to have a consistency with all the stakeholders of enduring partnerships that goes beyond the term of a political government.
Great. Thank you. And Paula?
I would take the word that someone mentioned about confidence. I think there is a lack of trust and a lack of confidence as a consequence of the lack of response, the lack of states' capacity to respond to their obligations. And we need to be aware of that, and we need to work on that. And the only way to work on it is working together and working with the people. All this wording about localization agenda and having and taking into account the people's interests and capacities, I think we need to work better on that. And I think there's always hope. There's always a window of hope, even in the worst crisis, for states to start. And they don't have to have a law. I think that's a good, also, and I want to go back to that, that's also a good, it's the best practice possible to have a law, but they can start doing it without the laws. That's also something that we have seen in some countries. So windows of hope, but only working together and working with the people themselves as partners to rebuild that trust.
that is needed.
Great. Thank you very much. And Walter?
Let's, on the one hand, focus more on bottom-up approaches. That's the IDPs themselves, the displacement-affected communities, the local governments, the affected countries. But at the same time, complement these bottom-up approaches with a more coherent global institutional framework. I hope very much at the end of Robert Piper's mandate that we would have something like, ideally within the framework, despite all the political difficulties of the General Assembly, an agreement on some key principles, an agreement on a follow-up process that is has authority because it's accepted by the international community, particularly the affected states, but the whole community as such.
Great, thank you. And Trygve?
Yeah, I mentioned the partnership conference back in 1994, and one of the recommendations, I cited only one small one, was actually, this was on IDPs, was the need to involve local and national NGOs and the IDP population themselves. And I think that has to be underscored all through this exercise. And I think it's so important that you and also on the legal side or the formal UN side always check out with the local population, does it work? Are these reports, the analysis, numbers of use for those that is actually there on the ground?
Great, thank you. Does sound like we have, a lot of nodding heads and a lot of agreements on stage right now. So I just want to take the time to thank all the speakers for joining us today and your wonderful inputs. It's been a really pleasure moderating this discussion, as well as the participants. We truly appreciate your attention, your efforts, and your continued dedication to the issue of internal displacement. As we exit the stage, I'd like to call upon Mr. Robert Piper to come and give concluding remarks, who is, of course, the Special Advisor on Solutions to Internal Displacement to the UN Secretary General. And as we've seen and heard, I think he's got a really big job ahead of him, but we're all here to support and in collaboration, of course. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, that's a hard act to follow. I have my one page I've been writing, taking my notes. That's the one thing about being asked to give the sort of closing summary or comments, is that you don't really prepare a speech. Think I can relax and enjoy this, but you really got to focus. Thank you so much. Really big thank you and congratulations to IDMC. Alexandra, great partnership. Really, I think we all in this room appreciate how incredibly important data is to everything we do. Sumbul, I think, really made the point eloquently. This is a very busy week this week in Geneva. We have a lot going on, and the reason why we have a lot going on is because the IDMC annual meeting is today, and so many people have come from around the world to be here. We've tagged on, all of us, so many other meetings, so it's really thanks to NRC and IDMC that we have such a busy week. So thank you, and great to see so many people here. It's very important to take stock, I think, these 25 years, and we heard a lot of very important, I think, some historical perspectives from Jan, from Christelle, of course, from the report from Trygve, giving us some historical perspective on what has happened. And we have come such a long way in these 25 years since the guiding principles, since the first report of NRC and IDMC and its previous incarnation. The quality of the data has gone up exponentially. We have the ISC framework. Some of those of you who were with me, and we celebrated the 25-year anniversary of the guiding principles together, I made the point then, and I repeat it now. What we're doing today really is because we can stand on the shoulders of so many others who have been working at this so hard for the last 25 years, and many of them are in this room today as well. So let me really express my gratitude and my appreciation for what they have done that has enabled us to get this far. Hindsight is always, as they say, 20/20, but it is important, I think, to recognize some of the lessons that have come out in the past. And Paula, for example, was generous in talking about how Colombia has learned some of the lessons, some of them the hard way, about what they could have done differently, and now are course correcting. I think we've learned a lot in these 25 years about internal displacement. We made some assumptions that have been revisited and refined since then. We imported a lot of concepts from the refugee world at the beginning on internal displacement, concepts about host communities, for example. Even the notion of durable solutions was language that came from the refugee world, and they don't all fit. There's a lot in common between IDPs and refugees as forcibly displaced people who've been wrenched from their homes, lost their assets, highly vulnerable. The returns process of getting back to your community is pretty indecipherable between an IDP and a refugee. But the conversation with their governments, the conversation around accountability, the instruments we have to address solutions for internal displacement are really very different than they are for IDPs than they are for refugees. So we've, I think, learned a lot about the similarities between IDPs and refugees, but also the important differences, and we're still, I think, kind of getting that right. We've learned about camps and how they really must be only the last resort, because they seem like a good idea. They seem so organizationally good to have everyone in one place, etc., etc. But actually, as we look at IDP solutions, camps are a big problem. They tend to be difficult to close. They tend to create, in some cases, sort of demands or what you call supply sort of issues that make it more difficult for some people to move out. They draw in others from around. So we've learned a lot, for example, about camps, and we on the solution side, we're looking at it quite carefully. We've learned a lot about, looking back again, benefit of hindsight, about how we focused very much on the conflict side of things from the get-go, less on the disaster, less on the climate. And now, as Alexandra said, and I think Christelle, we're catching up on that. But in framing this at the outset, very much more on the conflict piece, we created a kind of political economy around internal displacement that was potentially quite more controversial than it had to be. We can see how many important lessons from countries like Fiji and Bangladesh and the Philippines on how they're dealing with displacement from disasters that creates a less sensitive, if you will, environment in which to discuss and engage with governments on these issues. But we learnt in the process. And of course, famously, we've learnt about the fact that we saw this as a short-term problem at the outset that would take care of itself. So yes, it can sit in the humanitarian ministry or in the victims unit in Colombia and or in OCHA at the UN, and it really should kind of take care of itself, and then the problems will go away, and the rest of us will get on with our lives, and the development process will still swing along. So we learnt a lot about understanding the consequences and indeed, sadly, the sort of chronic nature for many people of internal displacement. But looking ahead now at the next 10 years, and a lot of people, and Walter and others, we talked a bit about what needs to be, what are the challenges ahead. And if I think about it now, at the 35th anniversary of the IDMC and this reporting, what do we want to see for sure? Number one, we must see a profound restoration of agency to IDPs. Whatever we do, and this is the guiding idea behind everything we've been doing under the action agenda, under solutions, this has got to be about putting IDPs at center stage. And I think, of giving them the choice. Sumbul, again, I think emphasized this as well, that for us, solutions is about giving IDPs a choice, about putting them in the driving seat, about giving real options. Intention surveys that generically ask people if you'd like to be home or here really aren't aren't truly useful unless IDPs are actually given an actual choice, of being given the respect of different options, behind each of which is a government commitment to implement and a willingness to put resources behind it. So for us, that's got to be a guiding idea. Second, hopefully, even better knowledge and data. We've talked about it today. Christelle touched some of the gaps, the data around duration, but the knowledge about individual households. It really bothers me how we tend to treat IDP populations as big, homogeneous groups of people, camps, you know, this is the situation for this camp, or worse, this city and the hundreds of thousands, say, of Colombians who are living in Bogota or wherever it might be, in Maiduguri. I hope over the next 10 years that we really get much more serious about granular data, household by household. One of our panelists talked about the difference in the needs of different generations in the same household. Kids who were born in Bogota 15 years ago are going to look at the idea of returns very differently to their parents and their grandparents. Women and men, obviously, indigenous people, these very different perspectives. And I hope the next 10 years is about really getting much more granular about the needs of individual households. I think they deserve that. Third, I hope the next 10 years is about government leadership. And we've talked about that a lot, and I'm glad Walter managed to plug his book, because if he hadn't, I would have done it for him. But it is a very important piece of research, and I recommend it to everyone in this room. It was the core message of the high-level panel, bringing governments, making sure that governments take responsibility for their internal displacement challenge is absolutely central to our solutions vision. But something has to also change on the way in which we respond in the initial context. That for us to, on the one hand, expect governments to take more responsibility requires us, on the humanitarian side, to also find ways of bringing them in much more of a partnership. I came from my last sort of visit to a country was northeast Nigeria a couple of weeks ago. And 12 years into this crisis, with still 2.2 million IDPs, and a desperate need for more resources to sustain this very long-term effort, we need a very different relationship between the humanitarian system and the state governments in northeast Nigeria. How do you build that partnership? So that government leadership that we all look for is a very complicated equation, but it requires a lot of give and take on both sides, if you will. Fourth, I hope we will see climate change and climate financing really coming into this picture. It's very overdue. A country like Somalia that's dealing with millions of internally displaced people who are in the first instance displaced by insecurity and seeking safety in towns. But it's very obvious in the second instance behind this is a profound climate driver of 5 years of drought. So when you ask people in Baidoa whether they will go home next year, security permitting, they already can say, no, our livelihood as we knew it once upon a time where we came from is no longer viable. And so we hope that the loss and damages debate, for example, that when we come up with a financing instrument, that it'll be there for countries like Somalia who are dealing with a massive displacement issue that is not by any means exclusively of their doing, but got everything to do also with the consumption patterns of people like us in the global north. Sixth, I'm nearly done, is to make sure indeed that we have much more of this issue of moving this displacement issue into the development domain. It is, and it remains very much in conversations around the humanitarian community. We work closely, the Asian Development Bank is here, now with the World Bank, with the IMF, with the African Development Bank and others we are working very hard in our team with many of your support to make sure that the issue of internal displacement finds its way into the SDGs, finds its way into the conversations at the World Bank about leaving no one behind, about the poverty agency that worries about vulnerability. I think this has got to be a major shift in the venue in which the conversation around internal displacement takes place. An international forum, this is something on our minds, and Walter made this point, but the next 10 years, and I hope much less than 10 years, has got to be a breakthrough on the international institutional architecture around internal displacement. There is no home today for this discussion. And internationally, there's no natural home. The solution is not a new institution, that's for sure. We don't need new institutions. There are already too many. But we need a place where these conversations can take place, where member states can see the issue much more holistically, can connect the conversation around loss and damages with the humanitarian response in Somalia, with the investments by the World Bank on rural development or resilience building and so forth. That venue doesn't exist. Walter is absolutely correct. It's the last page of the action agenda the Secretary General proposes. A forum of some kind is created, and it's got to be a priority. And then last, but of course, most importantly, we've got to reverse the trends. The next few years has got to be about reducing this exponential jump in new IDP displacements, doubling in 10 years, getting in front of that, particularly with our climate adaptation and risk reduction measures, so that we really move much earlier on from the crisis itself, which will save lives, it will also save money if that's also important to you. And the second part of reducing these numbers, of course, is to move more people out of displacement more quickly. And that is the primary focus of the work of my team, coming up with solutions, coming up with new approaches to solutions that put government in the driving seat, that open up new sources of financing, and that provide IDPs finally with an opportunity to break out of this, in many cases, very protracted sense of being in limbo. That has got to be the breakthrough of the next few years. So congratulations. Thank you, everyone, for listening to me. Thank you for the panelists for sharing their insights. Really enjoyed this afternoon's discussion. Very much appreciate the ongoing relationship with IDMC. And I think there's a cocktail next, but maybe I let someone else do the closing logistics. Thank you so much.
Hi there. So I'm here to do the closing logistics. And wow, I just really, I don't know about you, but I learned quite a bit over the last couple hours. So I want to thank everybody who spoke, everybody who came, and I think we all have a lot that we can take forward from here. I hope before you take it forward, though, that you do stop and have a drink and talk and hang out with each other and share some of that knowledge and all the wealth of knowledge from everyone that's here. So there will be a cocktail right outside, just as you leave the door. And we hope that you stick around and enjoy each other's company. So before you do, I just want to say thank you again to all the speakers who came. Thank you to the AV crew from Global Vision and to the Hotel Royale for hosting us today, and also for all the IDMC staff who volunteered for many different odd jobs that you probably didn't notice, and that was exactly the way it was supposed to go. So, oh, I'm sorry, you don't know me. I'm Mark Gannat. I'm the new head of communications at IDMC, so hopefully you will see me around at some future events. Thank you for my boss, Alexandra, for reminding me to introduce myself. Thanks, and hope to see you at the cocktail. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
you.